we don't get random static. If you need to talk, of course, you can always unmute your mic. Feel free to stop me as well. And if you have something, you can say it on a chat as well. Somebody will read it out, because I won't be monitoring the chat because I won't see it, but somebody from our team will. Krish, I think you can hit record, the button, and we can get started. You start recording, just let me know, Krish.
Yeah, I did.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks everyone for coming. As you probably saw the title of this. It was like what API, how API, Squid API. So if you're not familiar with APIs, like that's the point of today's presentation. I'm gonna keep it very like beginner level. Assuming you know nothing about APIs at all. I'm guessing you guys do know that it's somewhat related to programming. It is like a programming sort of like we will be programming in this workshop. Because I know that like you guys might not have like like a tool set up. You guys might not have a specific ID set up. We're gonna use like an online code editor and have the link. So like I'll share that with you guys so that you guys can follow along. If you don't want to follow along with the code, you just want to run the code. I also have the link that I'll put up on the chat as well, which is the link to the and then you guys can just like look at the code there, or you can just watch me as I code as well. There won't be too much coding. It'll be more first understanding what an API is, how we can use it, and then we'll also get to some coding as well. The Squid API part. The Squid API is like a tool that we're using at YC just for handling like our messaging and task management. But their API is actually still in development, and there's a few issues. So we'll only be using the Squid API to send messages, but we're not going to be doing more than that. So I'm going to get started. So I guess I just had to set aside before, but hey everyone. So just for some context, we're holding these like workshops to because everyone's at home, everyone's bored. We sort of want to keep like that knowledge transfer and just keep like learning still going on within the YC team. And we also thought that we'd engage the community as well. So just like make these workshops open so that people who are somewhere else can also join as well. Because typically like when we have workshops in Fort Mac, a lot of people can't join because they're at a specific place or someone has something else going on. So we just wanted to share this online for that. Dhruv yesterday presented how to build effective products, and today I'm going to be talking about APIs. So where that fits in a picture is like if you're building a software product, you're most likely going to have an API. Yeah, and then my email is also on the slides. If you guys have any questions after the presentation, you can feel free to just like email me a question or and let me know. So my main goal at the end of this workshop is like you guys should walk away with these 3 questions answered. So what is an API? Why do we need an API? Why do we use APIs? How can I use an API? And then we'll see like what are the different ways to actually use an API, because there's not just like one way to use an API. So the how API part has a few different subtopics as well. Yeah, and like if you guys are on your computer, we will be coding, so just like make sure that like you have just like make sure that like you're ready to code. So let's get started with what is an API. Has anybody actually heard of an API before here, or like just use it? Just like I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, definitely heard of it.
Ever heard of it?
I've used some of the popular ones.
Oh, like which ones?
Like Google Maps API.
Okay, right. Yeah, I think Maps is one of the popular ones. So just for some background for people who don't know what API is, a lot of large companies, they have APIs both for their customers, so like the actual product that you're using, but they also have APIs sometimes for internal use. So to like sort of bring it back from, to bring it away from like computer terms, you can think of an API as like, if imagine you're at a restaurant and at the restaurant you're going to be at the restaurant ordering food, and then there's going to be a waiter and there's going to be a kitchen and the chef that actually prepares the food. The API, you can sort of think of it as the waiter at the restaurant. So your menu will be like, your order will come from the menu, and then the waiter is going to take your order, and it's going to take that order to the kitchen, and then whatever food that the kitchen preps, it's going to bring it back to you. And so what that looks like in computer terms, because you might not have heard these terms before, is that you have a request and you have a response. So the waiter is going to take your request, which is in this case the order, and it's going to tell the system, which is in this case the kitchen, what to do. And then it's going to deliver that response back to you, which in this case is the food. And from this example, like, you might be able to see why you want a waiter, right? Like as a person eating at the restaurant, you don't want to have to worry about like managing dishes, how much inventory stock of food there is, when to give the food, where to place you, all those things you don't want to have to worry about. You just want to get the menu, order the food, and then the food should be there in front of you. But all that behind the scenes work is actually done by the waiter to communicate to meet that request that you've made. And so in like one sentence, you could say that an API is a messenger that takes requests, tells the system what to do, and then gives a response back to you. And like the most familiar example that you guys can I can think of that you guys can sort of relate to is that every time you go on the internet and you type in a URL, like if you type in facebook.com, that's gonna go to like when you type in facebook.com, that's a specific request. Your browser is what's going to take that request, and so in computer terms, it's called a client. And then your browser is going to take that request as a client. It's going to go send that request to Facebook's server, which is a system, and then Facebook's API will then respond with the web page. And then your browser will then get the response, and then you will be presented with the web page with all the content on the web page itself. So maybe here's like a different way to put it out. So there's human, which is you, the application, and then the API and the server. So like you shouldn't confuse the API as being the server. There are two separate things. Because the API is just one part of the server, which is going to receive requests and it's going to send responses. And so the API is not the server, but it's just handling the receiving and sending a request itself. So every time you visit facebook.com, you are technically calling an API, but it is like a special sort of API because you're only querying for web pages, and your browser will only take in like every time you go to facebook.com, your browser gets some HTML code and then shows it to you. But there is a sort of a different type of API where you're not getting web pages back, but you're actually getting data back, and that's what we're interested in today because we wanna because like all the pages that we get on browsers are sort of like user interfaces for people to use, but APIs are a way to pass data around and to work with just raw data itself in a structured way. And so we're more interested in the data itself. So then you might be wondering, okay, so then how do I actually get that data? So there's different ways to get the data depending on what you're programming in, right? Like if you're programming in Python, you can get the data using some of their functions to call, or if you're making a web page, you can also use some of their functions to get the data. But from your browser can also call APIs that return data. So I'll show you an example. So you guys can still see my screen. Can you guys see the new tab that I opened?
Yeah.
Okay. So we know that like if you go on github.com, this sends a request to GitHub's server, and then it gives us this response, which is this web page, right? Like everything we're seeing here is a specific web page that we got, and all of its code is going to be specifically HTML code. But we want APIs that return us data. So GitHub has its own data. Has its own API that also returns data. So with a browser, we can also query GitHub's API. So I have api.github.com, and then I've got to a specific path, which in API terms is called an endpoint, and I'm just querying my specific user data. Of course, I can go back and query at a top level node and maybe see other users. And so if I just query this specific endpoint, I'm getting a certain amount of users from GitHub's API. And so this is a way to see which data an API can give us. But okay, so just before we go on, I just want to clarify once again. So when you open a web page, it is technically like an API where a request goes out and then the request gets fulfilled by a response. But in this case, we're getting specifically not a web page, but we're getting JSON data. So JSON just stands for JavaScript object notation, but it's just like data in a structured way that now we can actually parse this and use this somehow in our application. But this isn't all that an API can do. An API can do much more than just getting specific data. And so let's see what that is. But just know that like any single website you visit is going to have an API that it's using to actually serve the data. So this is GitHub's, but Instagram actually has its own API that like if you like, and their API is closed because they don't want people taking their data. But like with like when it used to be open a few years ago, you could actually see and query the API for images, and then it would show you the tags that had put on your specific images. And so usually like the data has a lot more metadata, for example, created that just other data that it might not present on a web page, but is still part of the database itself. For example, this ID, like this ID is never going to show up on the web page, like when you go to my profile, but it's going to show up in the data itself, because when you're writing an application for GitHub, you're probably interested in the ID. So on that point of a database, so where does that come in? So when you have web pages, all that code is just in like one HTML file, or a bunch of HTML files with some JavaScript. But when you're working with data, you're probably going to be storing that in some sort of database where you can read to it, you can write to it, you can update it, and you can delete the data, which is on the slide. If you're seeing like the CRUD, that just stands for create, read, update, and delete. But basically, you want to be able to, like, usually you have a database and it's built using some, database technology. But let's say GitHub is an API and they're storing all the users in like some special GitHub's, personal database. They still want to expose that to other developers. Like, what if I want to create an application where I'm creating a game where like I'm tracking every time a user jumps, it should like add that to the GitHub repo. So I want to talk to the database, but I don't want to have to do that by connecting to the database using their credentials, right? Because like if you give someone access to your database, then they're gonna be able to do whatever they want with it. But that's why if you expose an API, which is like what they call exposing an API, you'll be able to give specific endpoints and be like, okay, on this specific path, for example, user/Dhvani35729, I'm gonna return the data from my database. So when I go to GitHub's API, GitHub's code is going to call its API on its, it's going to call its database on its server and return the data. And then the API will then return that data from the database back to me. So I'm not directly talking to the database, like you're seeing in this diagram. The API is talking in between through that like server, which is like the middleman in between. You might have also heard of this thing called REST. If you're sort of, maybe if you're like just like following APIs, or if you're into coding. And so if you're wondering what REST is just a set of constraints when you're actually creating an API. It's just like, it sort of defines, specific behaviors that like your API has to follow for it to be called the REST API. You shouldn't get caught up too much in what all the constraints are, especially if you're starting off new. And so I sort of kept them away from these slides, but they are linked at the end, where if you're interested, you can go look at what exactly those constraints are. But for us, REST APIs are what we're going to be using. Mostly, like as you can see, over 70% of all public APIs are going to use REST. And anything that uses REST is, you might hear a term that it's a RESTful web service. That just means that it fulfills that requirement of being a REST API. So let's break down what a REST API request actually look like. Because remember, we're sending requests here and we're getting responses. That's the terminology we want to use. We're sending requests and we're getting responses. And the API is how we're going to be sending requests and responses. So there's 4 parts of a RESTful API request. There is the URI, which is basically the URL. It stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. It's a URL is like a subclass of URI, but you can sort of just think of it as a URL. The HTTP method. So I talked about how like API is a bit different from just calling a single browser page, and it's because you can do more than just getting specific data. And that's where this method part comes in. So there's a lot more methods than these 4 here, but for us, like for our interests, these are probably like the most used ones. And even in practice, there's like a few special ones you might use, but you're mostly going to be using these 4 methods. So they are get, post, put, and delete. So get allows you to retrieve data from a resource. So when I was on GitHub's API, like this specific call right here, this is basically a get request. Like my browser is doing that for me. It's going to like GitHub's API and it's setting, and it's doing a get request and getting that for us. If you're on your browser, you can actually see this request being made. If you go to the network tab, if you're wondering how I got here, I should show you this. So if you're in Chrome or if you're in Firefox, if you right click and you click inspect, you'll get this like bottom developer console thing. In here, there's a bunch of different tabs, but the one you want to go to is a network tab. And then just hit a refresh page, and it's going to capture all the different network requests the page is making. So you'll see that one of them is my username. And so this, you'll see that the browser is doing this for us. It's making a request, and it's going to this URL, and it's making a get. You've seen the request method here is a get. And that's why your browser, like, inherently does gets for you. But you can do more than gets. You can do post, where you're actually posting data to a database. And it's usually done if you have like a form and you want to submit data, or if you want to create like a new user in a database, you're going to use post. So post usually implies that you're creating new data. Put means you're updating an existing resource in your database, and delete just means you're deleting a resource. And so when you specify these methods, the API code that's handling your request will change what it's doing based on which method you made the request with. But you see that like already we have a lot more powerful things that we can do than from just going to facebook.com and getting that page. We can do more than just get data. We can post, put, delete, and do all those things with that data with that same URL. There are also headers and the body. So headers are just like metadata about your request. So for example, let's say if you go back to GitHub's API, everything over here we're getting is in JavaScript, but we don't actually have to return the data that we get in this format. We can actually return this data in a different format. For example, in XML, like you might have heard this format called XML. So there are different ways to return this data, or you might return as plain text, where it's just like a paragraph of text with no, nothing specifically related to like a JavaScript object here. And so what the headers allow us to do is that one example header is this thing called accept. And then you can say, okay, I want to accept only JSON data. Or if you're making a post request where you're actually submitting data, you can say, okay, I'm submitting a new user's data as JSON data or as XML data. And so the headers are basically metadata that sort of like goes along with the request to the server, so the server can respond based on those headers. And again, in Chrome, you can also see those headers on that same network tab. If you click on the request, you see that there is response headers. So there's response headers, and sometimes there's also request headers. But your response, we'll see, also has specific headers. So here are request headers. So they're a bit down here. So seeing that, okay, we have like, accept specific languages or accept. Right now we're just accepting anything. It could be HTML, could be XML. We're accepting any data. But all of this is like metadata that goes to the server. For example, what computer I'm using, what browser I'm using. That is part of the header that goes to the server that's handling that request. The body is only needed if you're making a post or put or delete call. So if you're trying to create a new user, you're gonna have to pass the data for that user, and that's where the body goes in. The body is a part of the request that has the actual data. So that's just to summarize again. We're going to be working with REST APIs, and what that means is that we're going to be specifying a URL, we're going to be specifying the method, we might specify some headers if we need to, and we're going to be specifying the body when we're not making a get API call, but we're making post, put, or delete API calls. Anybody have any questions on what an API is before we get into why use an API and how to use an API? Like, anybody's still unclear? Like, I can show you a different example if you guys are still unclear with the GitHub API on why on like what an API looks like. Any questions, or everybody's still good?
Can you show another example?
Yeah, sure. So let's go to so anyone can create an API. At the end of the workshop, I'll show you how you can create your own API, but someone's made this Pokemon API. Okay. So if you go to their Poke API, you'll see that like when I went to this URL, I didn't get like a web page back. Like this is what I got back was specific data, and so they have a bunch of different paths here. But let's go to this Pokemon specific endpoint. So we're seeing that okay, so this specific API is giving us 964 Pokemons, and these are all the Pokemons. So we have all the Pokemons and we have the URL to that specific Pokemon's data. And so if you go to a specific Pokemon's URL, again, like the key thing you should note is that we're not getting HTML pages back. We're not getting a web page back. We're getting specific data back. And right now we're just getting data, but we could actually be using the same path. You'll see that we can post data to this API. So here you're seeing that, okay, this is giving us its abilities, its forms. We have a bunch of other metadata like the height of the Pokemon, the ID, its moves. And so, users aren't going to see this, but when you're programming, or let's say you're making an app and you're making like a Pokemon card deck app, right? You want to get all the Pokemons that exist, from some database. And some guy probably has it already in his database, and this allows us to get like from our app, we can use this URL and get this data in like in a format that's easy to work with. Like in our code, this is going to become a variable, and then we're going to say, okay, Pokemon dot height, and then that gives us the height of the Pokemon for all the Pokemons that are out there, right? Like we don't have to actually go through and parse the web page. Any other questions, or is that good? Yeah, sure. So there's different, like REST is just one type of API, but there's another one called SOAP. It's like a funny name, but so SOAP, what SOAP is that it more relies on XML, and the behavior of it is just different. Another one is there's this thing called protobuf, where instead of sending like this data right now goes across like the network as a string of JavaScript data. But you can imagine that if you're sharing a lot of data, your network might get not congested, but there's going to be some lag as that you're working with a lot of data. So recently, there's this thing called protobuf, where you send your API data as binary. So like you sort of encode that data into a much more condensed format, and you send that over the web. So those are like not RESTful APIs, right? Like they don't conform to being RESTful, but they are used in specific applications, for example, like embedded devices.
Speaking to your like example of building an app for like a Pokemon database, so it would basically just use this like XML file, and then you would find like Pokemon Pikachu.height basically from that file.
So like this won't be a like instead of a file, I would sort of think of it as like having this data in a variable. You know how like when you're programming, you write like, oh, const is alive equals true, and then you can do whatever with that variable. You can imagine that an API allows you to get all of this in a variable, and then once it's in a variable, you can get all of it, all of these properties, because they're just something that's part of that specific variable. So like I wouldn't think of it more as less of a file and more of as a variable, or like a holding of data.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sure. So I don't actually have an API that returns. I don't have an API that returns XML. but I can show you what that looks like. So XML looks something like this. Maybe, yeah. So like, I guess let's just work with this right here. So with XML, so with JSON, which is JavaScript object notation, everything is going to be surrounded by curly braces, and then your curly braces are going to have keys. So these are all keys, and then your keys are going to have values. So your values can be strings, they can be numbers, they can be booleans, they can be nothing, arrays, or they can be other objects. So like, for example, damage class is actually an object that has another key called name, and then URL. And then those are strings as well. And so JavaScript works as like having curly braces and then keys and values. XML can represent the same data. XML can do a bit more, but that's getting to the advanced XML. But usually XML, you're using these tags. So like you might be familiar with this because HTML actually has tags like opening div and then closing div. So same thing with XML. You have like opening note, opening date, closing date, and that's how sort of XML works, where like you have opening and closing tags, but you can represent the same data you're doing in JSON in XML as well. Is that good?
Wait, so why do they use XML and not just HTML then?
Why not? Wait, so why use XML over JSON, or why use XML over HTML?
Over HTML.
So HTML is a specific so HTML is for web pages. HTML is, so your browser understands HTML. Okay, so like when I go to google.com, HTML just means that like your browser will take that HTML and convert that into like a button, for example. Like your browser is doing that. What we don't want to send data, like an API is not doing this for a browser. Like right now I'm opening this in a browser, but we're going to be using this data in code, right? And so we don't want to send data as something that your browser is trying to understand. We want to send just the data itself. And that's why XML is like HTML is XML, but we're going to use XML specifically because like we don't want to add the things to make it an HTML document because we're not trying to send this to a browser.
Oh, okay. Makes sense. Thanks.
Yeah. But you can use XML as HTML. Right?
If you take any HTML document, the tags it uses is XML notation. So I'm not sure what you mean by using it as XML. Like, do you mean use it as like data?
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Right. So yeah, you can do that because like your browser, for example, is a program that does that. Your browser converts that HTML into a specific data.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, so I won't spend too much time on why we're using an API because like you'll sort of understand why we're using an API once you start building applications. But if you're just curious, beforehand, like these are some reasons, some advantages of using an API. So one of them is abstraction. So what that means is that I talked about this before, but when you have a database of information, or like sometimes you have a big team working on a specific project, and sometimes internally these teams will be working on different components, and you don't want to share the implementation details, right? Like you don't want to share exactly what that specific code is doing or how that database is working. Is it, for example, is a database using like SQL database, or is it using some like special JavaScript database? Like you don't want to share those details with your users or your customers. You only want to expose specific data, and so an API allows you to abstract away all the implementation details and just allows your customers to just get data, add data, delete data without having to worry about how that's actually done. Like we'll see that like we'll be able to send data to a database, and we won't even have to worry about how the database is working. It's just going to work for us because the API developer has told us that, okay, here's the endpoint. Just use this URL for everything, and then the API will handle everything on the server side. And so abstraction is a really important point because often you don't want to share implementation details with customers. The other point is automation. You can imagine that like because we have structured data, what we can do is that you could have a script that like, for example, like let's say you're playing a game and they have data. You can have a script that checks the accuracy of every single move, and then like just imagine that this database was being updated like every day. You can write a script that checks what's the move with the highest accuracy, and then use that in your game every time because you have this API set up. Or another example is like if you're using a calendar API, you could set up notifications with your calendar and then link that with like a weather API. For example, when the weather temperature goes below a specific, like let's say when the temperature drops below 0 degrees, create an event on my calendar to go outside and like buy heat or something. Like you can basically connect different components because you're getting structured data. You can make all of these things automatic because now programs can understand this and they can do a lot more and automatic things. And that's what looks in the point of integration, because GitHub has an API, Instagram has an API, we have a Pokemon database API. You can imagine that now we can build applications using this API and integrate many components that wouldn't otherwise talk to each other. Efficiency just means that like it sort of goes in the same point of integration, because efficiency is that you can publish data automatically. For example, let's say you have an API for all your articles for a newspaper. If you have a mobile application and a website, let's say you hired person A to make the mobile application and you hired person B to make the website, you give them both your API, which has the article data, and when you add a new article, both of them don't have to do anything, right? It's very efficient. You just update that one API and all of your customers that are using it, in this case, only 2 people will get it updated, which is very efficient than having to go through each one. Okay, so let's get into start working with APIs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this URL and I'm going to post this on the Meets channel, because I think like you guys all have Meet open. If you want to open the code and see the code, but otherwise, what you guys should do is that like it'll really help if you guys follow along, because I have kept this like very vanilla JavaScript. So I'm using no special like framework, no special extra code. I'm using pure HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and we're going to be coding online, so you need nothing installed. And so I would encourage you to get JS Fiddle. Let's just like open this website. It's gonna give you. You don't have to log in. It's gonna give you like a just like a sandbox. It's gonna look different. If you want it to look the way I have it right now, if you hit settings, you can click the layout and change it to tabs. And there's a few other settings here like auto run your code, or you can sort of play around with these settings. But like yours probably looks like classic, where it has like 4 different tabs like this. You want like I just have it as tabs. So like otherwise it's the same as what you have on your browser as well. So let's just make sure that this works. I'm just going to add an H2 saying hello world. I'm just going to add some CSS. Just like I'll give you some time to get this opened up. Have you guys gotten this opened up? Like, is it working for you guys? Can somebody confirm so we're good to go?
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, that's fine.
Do you not need to use like actual proper HTML like format for this, or because you're not using any of the doc types and all that?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question, Neil. So this sandbox hides that from us, and so like we don't actually need it. And like in practice, it's good to have it, but like you don't actually strictly need it. And like for the sake of this like workshop itself, like I would more focus on our API JavaScript code. Don't worry too much about the HTML, because like we're gonna learn about how to actually call APIs, right? Not more about how HTML works. Okay, so I'm gonna assume that like you guys already know CSS and you know HTML. There won't be any complex CSS or HTML, so don't worry about that. It's just like I'm not gonna be going over like what Neil said, like why is there no doc type HTML?
But how'd you get yours to be tabbed? It's sort of like a weird.
Yeah. So if you go to settings, you see the top right, the settings. You can change the editor layout. One of them is tabs. So you're probably on classic, but there's different layouts that you can choose from.
Yeah, I got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get started then. Have you guys? So it sounds like you guys have gotten like it working. So let's first just call an API. Okay. So as you can guess, all of the code is going to be in JavaScript to call APIs. I want you guys to open the console because I want to show you specific things as we're making these API calls. So to open the console, again, right-click, click Inspect. Once you get to Inspect, you'll get this bottom panel from Chrome. I want you to go to Console. So there's a bunch of different tabs here. There's one called Console, and it's probably helpful to clear your console because it's probably like a bunch of random messages. So there's a Clear Console button over here. Okay, so the way to call APIs from JavaScript, we're going to use this function called fetch. So there's like two different ways to do it. One is like Ajax, one is just use fetch. We're going to use fetch because it's a lot more modern. If you're curious about how it works, just give a quick Google search. You're going to type in fetch. For example, type in fetch headers. And there's going to be this website from Mozilla. And again, this is linked on the slide, so don't worry about having to save this link. But it has a walkthrough, a tutorial of actually how to use it. So like, even if you don't like fully pick up all that I'm saying here, you can always refer to this web page, and like it's very well written on how to actually use this API. But we're going to use fetch. So let's just get started. So the first API we're going to call is the GitHub API, just because we're familiar with it. So I'm going to paste the URL in here, and I'm going to make that my first line. Can you guys see my code okay? Like, is it too small? Is it too big? Or like, is it good?
No, it's good.
Fine, we can see it.
Great. So I posted the link on the chat again if you guys just want to paste this in. So now so let's see what this is actually doing. So let's print to console this fetch function. So when I console the log this fetch specific this function, we're getting a promise back. So again, I'm not going to go into what promise means, but in JavaScript we have this thing called promise. And so the way and so from here you can already tell that, like, we can't just constantly log the fetch data, but we have to get the data from this API call, from this function. So what a promise, again, I don't want to spend too much time going what a promise means, but is that we have to resolve the promise. So the way to do that is we're going to use this function called .then. So on that same function, I'm just going to go on a new line. I'm going to type in .then, and I'm going to type in response, and then I'm going to use, and then I'm just going to print that response to the console. Also, if you don't want to hit run, the reason I'm doing it so quickly is like I'm typing Command Enter or Control Enter, and it should recompile your code. Okay, so in our console, what do we have here now? So we have a response. We have this JavaScript object. So already here you can see that this is sort of resembling what I was talking about before. We have a body, we have headers, we have this status, we have okay, true. And so this is good. It means that this shows us the response we're getting from the API. But how do we get the actual data? Because the data here, we're not actually seeing where that data specifically is. And that's because the body actually has the data stored away. And so to get the data, we have to do one more thing. We have to do .then. So the response has data, and we know it's in JSON. So up here, because I know it's in JSON, I'm just going to rename the variable to res, and I'm going to call the JSON method on my response object, and then I'm going to add one more .then. I'm going to take the data. I'm going to create a function here, and I'm just going to print the data to the console. Okay, so now I'm seeing the data. Are you guys also able to see this data that I'm seeing right now? Can somebody confirm that like they were able to make this fetch API call work? Was anybody having issues?
When I click run on mine, it says DevTools failed to load source map.
Right.
Some other stuff.
So you can ignore that message because like that's not relevant to your code here. But are you seeing like on your JavaScript, like for example, what I would do is like just add in one more console.log saying got data. Like usually what I do is like I just type in success, and then before I make the API call, I usually just type in fetching user data. So that way you'll know, and like these two messages you should be seeing in your console. If you're not, it means something's wrong. So like Lokesh, can you try running? Can you try adding a console.log and seeing if you're seeing that?
Okay, I'll do that.
Has everybody else gotten successfully gotten the data?
You are a fast.
Yeah, that's why I've kept the example not too long, but okay, sure. So we're calling a function here called fetch. That's why we have the function name, and then we have the parameter that we're passing it, which is just a string, which is a URL. That's giving us a JavaScript promise. A JavaScript promise is a specific JavaScript concept. What a promise allows us to do is that you can make a like just like TLDR, like basically to resolve a promise, we're gonna have to use this other function called .then, and we have to call that function as a part of the returning object that we get from this API call. So you know that like every time you call a function, let's say call this function, let's say call a function called add, I'm gonna get something back, right? So in this case, I'm gonna get the sum back, but I have to like because we're getting a promise back. On that same object that I get back, I have to use this called .then, which itself is another function, okay? So .then is another function, which again, but this time, instead of being a function that takes an argument, it's returning us an argument. So the argument that we're getting back is this thing called, well, you can name the variable whatever you want. I named it res for response. And then this notation right here allows us to take this variable that we got back and then do something with it. And so when I say do something with it, I mean I'm creating my own function here. So I'm saying, okay, give me the response, and I'm going to take that into my own function. But this function has no name. It's called an anonymous function. That's why we've wrapped it in curly braces and it's following this arrow. And now all the function code is going to go in here. And in here, I'm going to have access to this variable called response. So over here, I had response. I called .json function again on that object, and then I did one more .then, and I got the data specifically. And now I'm printing the data inside of this function.
Dhvani, I'm getting success, but then I'm not getting the data. I'm just getting like so it just is undefined.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a few things you should check. Is your URL the same that I have here? And then is your first .then, are you calling .json on that first response? Because I know most likely you're probably not calling .json, or it's not in the right order, for example.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
It's giving me uncaught in promise reference error responses index 41 not defined.
So you definitely have, like you probably have like the syntax somewhere messed up. Like because I can't see your screen, so like I can't fully help you debug, but like just know that like your syntax should look what I have here, where you're making a function called to fetch, and then you should have two .thens. Your first .then should be wrapped in one curly brace where you're calling res and then res.json. Like, can you confirm that like your syntax looks like this?
Wait,
Yeah, I know.
sorry,
I'm just
Neil,
going to do it.
what was the error?
My error was. Give me a second. uncaught in promise reference response index 41 is not defined. So I'm trying to find this index error.
Right, like I wouldn't get caught up in the error because it's probably not going to be useful. I would just make sure that my syntax is right because you're probably trying to access a variable that doesn't exist.
Yo, Dhvani.
Mhm.
For mine, it says object. It says success 39, but then there's nothing else coming afterwards. It says like success index 39, and then there's nothing else.
Do you have this, like, again, like if you, I can't see your screen, but
Do you want to let him share his screen?
yeah, sure, let's do that. Can one present? Wait, never share your screen. Like, again, like, please make sure your syntax is correct, because like if your syntax isn't correct, then like you're just not copying the code properly.
Yeah, I missed a bracket. Never mind, my bad.
Okay, so there we go.
Show your code again.
I got mine after too.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going just like in the interest of time and for people that do have it ready.
Okay.
Okay, so we have our data. Let's just like go ahead and say hi to the user that we're talking to. So let's just say hello, and then we're gonna add the username over here. Let's give this element an ID. Let's call it a greeting. So let's just try that first. So let's get this element in our JavaScript. I gave it an ID, so we can access that element by saying greeting node, and we can do document.get element by ID greeting. And then this node, we can set the inner HTML to add in a space and add in the name. And I know the name specifically is login because if you take a look at like the actual object, you see that one of the keys is login, and then one of the values is a string with my username. Some other ones are like bio, avatar URL, followers, and other things. But one of them is login, and that's why I was able to do data.login to get that specific key. I'm gonna keep this code on the screen, but I'm just gonna add a few more things, which are they're the same things. It's like different data. So let me just add a specific bio, and then let me just add a image as well.
Could you say your explanation of like the bottom piece of code again?
1 second. Which code? This code right here? Huh?
Yeah, that code.
Yeah, sure. So so I have my data now, but I need to set that data to the actual HTML, right? And so this first, what I'm doing is that I'm creating a variable called greeting node, and that's basically is going to be this HTML specific node, right? Like I'm trying to access this node, and so the way I'm going to do that is that I'm going to call document.getElement by ID, and I'm going to pass it the ID, which I've specified is the greeting, and that's going to return me this header to object. Once I have that in a variable, I can then add stuff to its HTML. So its HTML meaning this, its HTML is anything between its two opening and closing bracket, and I'm gonna add in, and a plus equal, this means, okay, keep the hello, just add in my specific login name. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, like, I'm gonna let you guys like again try to do it yourself as well. But there's a lot more data that we can work with here, and so you're seeing that I'm just gonna populate some data so we can actually see it. For the image, we don't want to specify the HTML, but we want to specify, you know, the actual image source, and so that's why I'm going to give it a URL. I'm going to specify the width as well to just 300. Okay, so who has connected their HTML element and gotten specific data from the JavaScript to the actual HTML? Can everybody?
Working on it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah, I got it.
You got it? So already you should be noticing the difference between this and me going in and adding this HTML. Like, you know, typically you would go into this bio and you would write the bio here. But with this way, the bio and greeting and image is not predetermined. It's not static. It's actually dynamic in that we're calling an API, and whatever that API gives us, we're then making the HTML after we get that data. So the good thing about being dynamic is that you can imagine now, instead of specifying a user, I could add an input box here and say, okay, put in your username, and then based on that username, we're gonna get data, and then create this web page. Like I can create this after the user specifies his username. And again, I haven't created a database here. I haven't even like thought about a database. I'm just calling this API endpoint, and it's giving me my data, right? And it's gonna be the same. And this code I won't have to change if I change to a new user. Like we can take an example. I don't know Krish, what's your username?
Yeah, that's it. Krish Crash.
So like if you, for example, try Krish's API endpoint, again, so if I had manually typed all this thing in, I'd have to change it all, right? But here, if I just change like the URL to Krish Crash, and you'll see that, okay, there we go. Now we have a new web page with Krish's bio, his name, and then his image, and I have to change nothing. And I also don't know how GitHub is storing this data, right? I don't know nothing about GitHub's database. They're not worried about me hacking the database because they've exposed this API to me. Now I have structured data I'm getting back that I can now display. Okay. So there's two things I was going to show. One of them is getting more data than this one specific node, getting like a user list, a list of users, and then showing that in a table. Or the other thing was actually posting data. So I'm going to start by showing you how to not just get data, but post data. Okay. So what I'm going to do is that let's create a form. Let's say we want them to put in a message, and we want them to input in a specific message. We want the type to be text. We want the value to be nothing. And we want the ID to be our message. Okay. And we want one more input to be the actual button. So value equals submit. Type equals submit. Okay, so I'm seeing a basic form over here where I have a message label, I have an input box, and a submit button. What we're going to do is that whatever the user types in here, we're going to make a post request. Okay, now this is going to be different from a get request, and that post request is going to go to this one of our APIs called Swit, and it's going to send that message to one of our channels. So like again, Swit is just like this is an internal software you're using, and we're going to send it over to this specific channel. Okay, so again, imagine you're creating an application where you want to send messages from one website to like a specific messaging website. Then we're going to use this to do it. So I was going to use onSubmit return message Swit. So we're going to create a function called message Swit. Again, I wouldn't get caught up in like all this HTML that I added, or like or like any of like like the types and ID inputs and stuff. If you're not familiar with it, the main takeaway is how to call APIs to get data and how to use APIs to send data. Right? Like our main focus today is like working with APIs. We're not trying to figure out how to make this image look nicer or how to make it smaller or anything. So let's call our fetch API, but let's actually send the data this time. So I have the link to it. Again, I'm going to post it on a Switch channel. I'm going to post it on our Zoom chat. Or has somebody posted? No, okay. Okay, I posted on a Zoom chat. So we're going to call this specific Switch API, okay? But this time, we're trying to send data. So you're only wondering, where do we send the data? Well, this function called fetch has another parameter that we can pass it. And here we can specify the method. And we can say, okay, we want to post data. We can specify some headers. So let's just say we want to send a content type, because we're trying to send the data as JSON instead of sending it as something else. Okay, that's good. And we want to send our actual message. So we have to send our actual message. And we said we're sending our data as JSON, so it has to be a JavaScript object. The key we're going to use is text, and we're going to specify sending. Okay, and so the message we send should be whatever the user types in this input box. So I know how to get that message. Document.getElement message dot. Because this still has to go as a string, like you can actually send a specific JavaScript object. It's going to be sent as a string. We're going to have to stringify, or which just means that it's going to convert a JavaScript object into a string and then send it over. So you're seeing that. Okay, so let's just slow down and see what we did so far. So we're still calling this fetch function. The first parameter is still the API URL, but we're passing in a few other metadata. One of them is a method, which is post. Another one is the header. And then the actual message that we want to send to the API. And of course, we can get the response back. We can turn it back into JSON. And then we can get the data back. And we can print the data. But because we're actually sending data, we're not really interested in the data that we get back, because it's probably just going to be like, oh, I successfully sent the message, or I didn't. Right now, let's just see that this actually works. So let's go in, and I'm going to do one more thing. It's going to return false. Let's say hi from workshop. So if we take a look at our Switch now, you see that we got a new message on our channel, and it's our test bot, and it's saying hi from workshop. So again, all of this code right here is a completely different application, right? Like we don't even know how this Switch.io website is working. We don't know where it's storing this in this database. All we had to do was we made our own components, and now we're calling it API, which is Switch API. And the way we're doing that is we're using this function called fetch, and we're specifying a few other metadata to send it over. And we can, again, send lots of new messages, and it's all going to work because the API call is handling all of our requests. If you want to see what data we get back, I'm printing it right here. I'm seeing a message of success, meaning that okay, it was successful in sending the data to the server.
Dhvani, so is that URI a link to the Switch API?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
The URL is linked to the Switch API, and generally, if you're trying to figure out how an API works or how to use it, they're gonna have documentation. Okay, so I have like Switch documentation open here, and the documentation always specify what endpoint to use. So for example, this is the URL openapi.switch.io, and then this is the specific endpoint /API/this. Here's the method you should use, which is post, and then here are the parameters you can pass it. So the body, you want to pass it the description, and all these other variables. And like if you're wondering where these go, this is gonna go when you're specifying that API request right here in your body. How do you know to call this text or to call this something else, right? Like that you're gonna figure out from the documentation, because the API is gonna have documentation to be able to do that.
Also, and the way that how you like posted data or like to the Switch API, could you like respond to a message from the Switch API? Or
Right. So just so you're saying that you want to comment, like for example, this message, you want to add a comment to a specific message already, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so again, so let's say I don't know how to do that, but you'd have to go here and be okay, message. So their documentation has a message. They have a specific tag saying comment on a chat message. Are you seeing this? And so
Yeah.
we're going to use this specific URL, and then we're going to specify one parameter, which is the message ID. So we're going to need the message ID, and then we're going to say the comment. And then once we add this as our body, it's going to work. The thing is, like their API actually doesn't, like, all this doesn't work yet. So, like, I can't show you in real time, but like Lokesh, like, this is how you would do it. Like, you're going to specify,
Okay.
there's going to be a new URL for what you're trying to do. And then you're going to specify in the body which message you want to add the comment on, and then what the content, and then what the comment should be.
Okay.
I don't want to go too much over time, but I want to just point out a few other things. There's a lot of public APIs that you might be interested in, okay? So let's take an example. So like, I have this link on the slides, and it links to this document of a lot of public APIs. Some of them, of course, require keys, and so you can actually use it without using the keys. Even with Swit, you actually need a key. I just gave it to you guys. And so some APIs you won't be able to access without the key, and sometimes you'll be only able to make a specific amount of requests until then it blocks you out. But some of them are still open. So for example, governments usually have APIs that they share. So the UK police has an API, and like this is the documentation for the API. Let's see some of the methods they have. So they have a forces API, and so if we call that API, let's see what we get back. So I just called the API from my browser again. Like, you could do this in code, and we're seeing that we're getting a bunch of data from, you know, the UK police's API data, and they have a lot of other data that they have as well. They have, like, you know, neighbors, neighboring teams, but there's a lot of different public APIs, and you can imagine a lot of different applications you can make, right? Like, you can make your own web app that, like, when an NBA team scores a specific amount of points, to then give you a notification, right? Or like, you can make your own. You make your own trading game by using data from the NBA, for example. So the API from the NBA, I think there's like a few of them. One of them is this one called API NBA. So, for example, let's just get all the leagues that are there. So you're seeing that over here. I can specify which language I'm using. So let's just say I'm using JavaScript, and let's say I'm using Fetch. So see, they even gave us the code. So you're seeing the same code that we were coding, right? Like, they're specifying the URL, the method, the headers, and then they have the same .then and then right now they're just printing it to the console. But you can imagine you can now make a game using data from the NBA, because the NBA is going to publish this data as well. You can get the players from a specific team. You can get this, or you can get like the teams from a specific league as well. And all this is, like, again, data that you can call from an API that you can now make your own app using. But you don't always have to make apps, right? Like, one other thing you can make is that you can actually make scripts. So I know a lot of you guys are familiar with Python, right? Like, I think at school you guys mostly use Python.
Yeah, we use Python.
Right. So I'm gonna share my entire screen now. So let's get some coding. So so let me open up a Python script that we're gonna use, and you'll see that, like, with APIs, because in this endpoints, you don't actually have to create web applications. That's just one application. You can create other stuff like Python scripts that, for example, like I said, monitors the weather API, and then every time something happens to it, you can make it do something else. So I have this script already made, just because I knew that we wouldn't have too much time to go through it. But again, this code again is already shared with you in that same GitHub URL. All the code is going to be there. But I just want to show that, like, you can make API calls from your like, from other languages as well. You don't need a web application. So I have this Python file. It's very short. It's not too long. I've named it bot.py. I'm importing this request library because that's what allows it to make requests. All this like, okay, so this timer is just like me making, like me setting this up, just that like this function gets called every second. But the main thing here is that to call an API, it's as simple as you specify the endpoint, which is the URL. You specify the data. So here I'm saying, okay, I want to send a message to our switch channel called I want data. And then I'm doing request.post. And so this post is our method. This could be request.get, request.delete, request.update. And then once I get that response back, which is this R object here, I'm just printing it. We're seeing that, but now you can imagine that, okay, if you already know Python, you can create your own applications where you're getting data, you're setting data, and then these scripts you can run from your computer. So let me just run this Python bot. And so I'm getting successful responses, but if I take a look at our switch channel, you'll see that on one of our channels, there's actually a bot that's now just like continuously sending data to this channel. So there's a lot you could do with this, right? And with an API, you can make scripts that call specific data. You can even show things in, so another thing I'll show you is you can even have tables where you're actually pulling in data from different endpoints. So like I showed you Pokemons, but how would that look if you made a table from that data? So let me just open up this application. So once you have that data, you can present it in different ways as well. You can either create scripts, you can create different forms for users to interact, or you can actually create and show the data in like a table format. So okay, so I have this like simple web page, and I click fetch users. All this data is going to come from that API. So what that means is that if they add a new Pokemon, I won't have to update my code. My code is going to stay the same. Once I hit fetch users, it's going to add that new Pokemon from their database automatically into my application. The last thing I want to show is how do you create your own API? What if you have your own database and you're trying to create your own API? So how hard is it to create your own API, or what does that look like? I think it's more important to understand what that looks like. So I'm going to show you just the code for doing that. So you're going to have a web server. Obviously, if you're trying to make an API, you're going to have a web server. But what you're going to do in that web server is that instead of returning HTML documents when a person goes to a path, whenever a user goes to one of your specific paths, you're going to return JavaScript data or XML data or whatever you want to return. Here I'm returning JavaScript data. So for example, right now I created this new, right now I have this server running this locally. And what I'm doing is that whenever someone goes to this path called, just like my localhost 300, I'm returning this message called it works. But you can imagine that over here now, here is where I would read database, and then I would get my database data from my database securely, because like the user won't know anything about this, and then I can actually return that data to the user just from my server itself. So you would actually have different like app.get for every single path. For example, users/all or users/ a specific user. Like that would probably be something that you auto generate. But you can imagine that like you can now return different types of data based on a different endpoint. Maybe you have any questions? I don't want to go too much overtime. I think like that's mostly all that I have to show you. The APIs I use are linked here as well if you're interested. The Squid API, like for non-YC members, like it'll get closed, so like you won't be able to post requests to that API, but like there are a bunch of other public APIs that you can work with. And there's a bunch of resources as well. For example, if you want to get more into web development or working with APIs specifically, or if you want to check out Swit, I'll like put a bunch of links here as well.
Dhvani, I just had one question. When I was looking at the SWIT like API documentation, like what we did was we went directly to the API, but like it said like before you do anything, you have to like get an authentication key and then put that back in to get another one and stuff. So like how would you go about that, like, and automating that?
Right. So you can't automate authentication. Authentication, you actually have to like do it yourself, right? So some APIs are going to be closed. So for example, Instagram's API or Switch's API, it's not a public API. It's called a private API. So with private APIs, the only difference is that you have to get a token, and once you have that token, you can, whenever you make a request, as like one of like the headers, you're going to specify that specific token, and then all your requests will work. Then everything else will look the same. But to get that token, I know Swit has a two-step process, Chris. So like it's a bit different from like, for example, Instagram's API. Instagram's API, so they just give you a token straight up. With Swit's API, you actually have to make the user click on this authorize button, which then loads a different page where the user clicks accept, and then you get a specific code, and then you pass that code on to another API, and then you get a token that lasts you 7 days, and you have to refresh that token every time. So Chris, like you can't automate it. It is a two-step process that you just have to do, and it's because that's the way that Switch decided to have its API.
So before this workshop, you did this and got the hook.swit?
Yeah, I can show you if you want.
Okay.
Emily, have any other questions though, besides like not related to the Switch, just APIs? Because then like the Switch, I can follow up with Krish after. But Krish, like I did get it working. Anybody else have any other questions though for which is like APIs or any of the code? If you've been browsing a specific repo, if you've seen any of the code, there is more code than what I coded today. So for example, I have this like other API call I'm making where I'm loading in users, and then I'm just like what I'm doing is I'm creating a table to show all the users in a table.
Is the PowerPoint going to be available to everybody?
Yeah, for sure. So the slides I'm going to send out as well. They're going to be part of the YouTube video's description. And also what we're doing is that from our website, if you guys the URL will be public, but what we're doing is that the format is going to be youthcomputing.ca/workshops/slides/ the name of that workshop. So like the last workshop we had was Drew's workshop yesterday. And so the URL for that is this workshops/slides/Drew-product is like, that was like the short name of the slides as well. So mine's gonna be the same. Mine's is gonna be Dhvani-API. It's just not done yet.
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay. Other than that, I think that was it for terms of APIs. Like, I hope you understand what an API is now, at least. Why do we use APIs? And at least somewhat of an understanding of how to use an API, because there are a lot of different ways to use it. And like, you know, you would need to know like HTML, JavaScript if you're trying to use a web. Like, if you're trying to use a web application, you won't be able to use an API if you don't know what a JavaScript promise is, or if you don't know how to create a table in HTML. But like, I hope you know at least what an API is, because you might not be using JavaScript. You might be using Python. You might be using Go. And for any language, it doesn't matter what the syntax is, but the main thing is that what an API is, right? Like, it's going to be taking requests. It's going to be giving you responses. And that's the main thing about APIs. Okay. I think that was it for terms of workshop content.